The explosives were live. The trigger was a heartbeat away. And the only person who could possibly intervene was a 22-month-old child who barely knew how to walk. This is not an action movie. This is the true story of a hostage crisis in 1977, where every expert's plan failed, and salvation came from the last person anyone would ever suspect. That child was Lena, the daughter of the housekeeper, Laura Chin, and the man wired with the shotgun was not a criminal, but a respected mogul named Richard Hall. For 3 days, the world watched a live broadcast of his potential execution as every tactical solution failed. So how did a toddler end up holding the key to his survival? To understand that, you must first see the fortress Hall had built around himself long before the explosives ever appeared. Richard Hall's fortress was his office on the 34th floor. Glass walls, a silent secretary, and a view of Indianapolis that made him feel like he was standing on top of a clockwork city he himself had wound. He was 48 years old, a mortgage company president who had built his reputation on saying no. No to extensions, no to excuses, no to sentiment of any kind. His business was moving money, and money, in his experience, flowed best through cold, straight pipes. He arrived each morning at 7:20. He took the elevator alone. He did not make small talk. The world below, the messy, noisy, unpredictable world of people and their problems, was a schematic he observed from a safe and clinical height. But that distance was an illusion, because down in that city lived a man named Tony Kiritsis. Kiritsis was everything Hall's system was designed to filter out: volatile, emotional, and desperate. A small-time real estate speculator who had bought property on the promise of a highway extension that never came. He was in deep to Hall's company, Merchants National Bank, for over $500,000 in today's money. And in the winter of 1976, the clock ran out. The pipes were about to be shut off. Hall's signature was on the foreclosure notice. It was not personal. It was procedure, but for Tony Kiritsis, it was the end of everything. Meanwhile, in a third-floor walk-up apartment that smelled of fried onions and mildew, Laura Chin was calculating margins of a different kind. Her alarm buzzed at 5:13. She had 17 minutes to get herself ready before Lena woke up. Lena was 22 months old, curly hair, a determined grip, and a habit of finding wonder in things adults had long stopped seeing: a dust mote in a sunbeam, the pattern of rain on a window. Laura's husband was gone, not dead, just absent. The kind of absence that becomes a space you learn to live around, like a piece of furniture you're always careful not to bump into. She cleaned offices for a living. The Hall building was her Friday account. It paid $20 more than her other jobs, which was the difference between Lena's shoes fitting this month or next. She did not clean the 34th floor. That was handled by a different service. Her world was the middle floors, the accounting departments, the copy rooms with their eternally jammed machines. She was thorough, quiet, and invisible, a skill she had perfected. She moved through the polished halls with her cart like a ghost, leaving only shine and order in her wake. She sometimes saw Richard Hall from a distance, getting into the elevator. A tall man in a precise suit, his face a closed door. She thought nothing of him. He was part of the architecture. But Tony Kiritsis thought of nothing but Richard Hall. He had begun calling the office. At first, the calls were procedural, requests for meetings, pleas for reconsideration. Then they became more frequent, more strained. The secretary learned to recognize his voice, the tight, rising pitch of it. She would patch him through to Hall's office, and Hall would deliver the same message, cool and impenetrable. "The decision is final, Mr. Kiritsis. There is nothing more to discuss." And then he would hang up. To Hall, it was just sound leaving a receiver. To Kiritsis, it was a slamming door. And with every door that slammed, the pressure in his mind built. Hall's own life was a study in controlled isolation. He lived in a Georgian-style home in the affluent Meridian Hills neighborhood. The house was kept by a live-in couple, the Millers. It was spacious, immaculate, and as quiet as a museum after hours. He had been widowed for 9 years. His wife, Elena, had died suddenly of an aneurysm. There were no children. The garden she had planted still grew, tended to by a landscaper. Hall never walked in it. He had a study with a leather chair and a wall of books he'd read once, a long time ago. His life had become a series of efficient, repeating circuits: office, home, club, office. He told himself he preferred it this way. Control was the point. Control over the money, control over the chaos, control over the unseemly eruption of feeling. On the other side of town, Laura's control was of a more desperate kind. It was the control of counting ounces of formula, of stretching a gallon of milk over 7 days, of knowing exactly which bus would get her to the sitters, and then to work with a 3-minute buffer. Her sitter was unreliable. The third time in 2 weeks that the woman cancelled, Laura did the only thing she could. She brought Lena with her to the Hall building on a Friday. She would keep her in the janitorial closet on the 12th floor, the one with the broken lock and a space behind the shelves. She brought crackers, a sippy cup, and a worn stuffed dog named Bingo. It was a temporary solution. It was against every rule. She just needed to get through the day. That same Friday, Tony Karitzis reached his breaking point. He drove to a pawn shop and purchased a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun. He sawed off the barrel and the stock himself in his garage. Then he bought wiring, electrical tape, and a length of thin, strong cable. He was not an engineer, but he understood leverage. He understood cause and effect. If they would not listen to his words, they would listen to this. He began to assemble a device in his apartment, a device that would physically tether one man's fate to another's. He called it his dead man's line. Richard Hall, unaware of the storm gathering 7 miles away, ended his week as he always did. He reviewed the foreclosure filings. Karitzis's file was on top. He initialed it without a flicker of hesitation. It was just business. He left the office at 6:10, drove his Cadillac home through the gray January dusk, and ate the meal Mrs. Miller had left warming in the oven. He read the Wall Street Journal. He went to bed. The house was so quiet he could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen downstairs. He noted the sound, as he noted all things, as data, a sign of an efficient motor. The following Tuesday, February 8th, Laura's sitter cancelled again, so Lena came back to the office. This time, the janitorial closet on 12 was being inventoried. Laura, her heart hammering against her ribs, took Lena up to the 34th floor. It was after 6. The executive floor was supposed to be empty. There was a small, unused conference room at the end of the hall, one she sometimes cleaned. It had a long table and a credenza. She could hide Lena under the table with Bingo and some toys. It was a terrible risk, but it was the only door left unlatched. At that exact moment, Tony Karitzis was walking into the lobby of the Hall building. He wore a long overcoat. Beneath it, he carried the sawed-off shotgun, the wires, and the cable. His face was calm, resolved. He took the elevator to 34. The doors opened onto the plush, silent hallway. He knew which door was Hall's. He had pictured it 1,000 times. He walked toward it, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. Inside his office, Richard Hall was finishing a call with his attorney. He was discussing the Karitzis foreclosure, the final steps. He hung up the phone, and then his office door opened. Karitzis didn't speak. He simply walked in, closed the door behind him, and pointed the shotgun at Hall's chest. Hall's first thought was absurd. This is a breach of protocol. His second thought was colder. He looked at the man's eyes and saw there was no negotiation left in them. Karitzis pulled the length of cable from his coat. In the conference room down the hall, 22-month-old Lena dropped her stuffed dog. It rolled out from under the table and into the open doorway just as Laura was reaching for it. And from the open door of Richard Hall's office, she heard a single, clear sentence that froze the blood in her veins. "We are going to be connected now, Mr. Hall, you and me, until this is finished." The connection was literal. Karitzis forced Hall into his leather desk chair and began to wire the sawed-off shotgun to the back of his head. He used the thin, strong cable, looping it around Hall's neck and then connecting it directly to the shotgun's trigger mechanism. It was a crude, brutal piece of engineering. If the cable was pulled, if Hall tried to run, if someone tried to tackle Karitzis, the gun would fire. It was a dead man's switch, with Hall as the dead man. Karitzis then taped a second wire from the trigger to his own wrist. "You see," he said, his voice eerily calm, "if they shoot me, my hand jerks, you die, we are partners now." Hall sat perfectly still. The cold metal of the barrel rested against his scalp. His world, which had been built on contracts and clauses, had just been rewritten in terms of physics and force. Down the hall, Laura stood frozen in the conference room doorway, her hand clamped over her own mouth to silence her breath. She had seen the man in the overcoat enter. She had heard the words. She looked down at Lena, who was toddling toward her dropped stuffed dog in the hallway. Every instinct screamed to grab her daughter and run, but the elevator bank was past Hall's office. The stairwell was on the other side of it. To flee, she would have to pass the open door. She pulled Lena back into the conference room under the long table and held her tight. "SHHH, baby, we have to play a quiet game," she whispered, her voice trembling. The first rule of her invisible life, do not be noticed, had just become a matter of life and death. Inside the office, Karitzis picked up Hall's phone. He dialed the building's front desk. When the security guard answered, Karitzis said only, "This is Tony Karitzis. I am in Richard Hall's office. He is my hostage. I have a shotgun wired to his head. Tell the police, tell the news." Then he hung up. He did not barricade the door. He wanted them to come. He wanted witnesses. Hall, from his wired position, watched the man's face. He was looking for the tells he knew from business negotiations, doubt, greed, fear. He saw none of them. He saw a terrifying clarity. This was not a negotiation. It was a performance, and Hall was the central prop. Within minutes, the first sirens could be heard, a faint whine rising from the street's 34 floors below. The Indianapolis Police Department's SWAT team was mobilized. They flooded the building lobby, sealed the exits, and established a command post in a vacant office on the 33rd floor. Their initial assessment was a nightmare. The hostage-taker was armed with a shotgun rigged to the victim. Direct assault was impossible. Snipers were useless. The device made traditional tactics obsolete. The commander, a veteran named Carl Roberts, received the first brief from building security. One hostage, one gunman, explosives suspected. And then, a devastating addendum. A cleaning woman and her infant child were unaccounted for and likely still on the floor. The situation had just doubled in complexity. Karitzis seemed to anticipate every move. He marched Hall to the office window, the cable between them taut. He opened the blinds with the barrel of the gun. The evening lights of Indianapolis sparkled below. He wanted the police in the adjacent buildings to see them. He wanted the world to see. "Wave," he said to Hall. Hall didn't move. Karitzis jerked the cables slightly. Hall raised a stiff hand. Across the street, a police sniper saw the gesture and the glint of wire. He radioed down, "Confirmed, hostage is rigged, I have no shot. Repeat, no shot." Back in the conference room, Laura's watch ticked past 6:45. Lena was growing restless, squirming in her arms. The child needed to move to Babel to be 2 years old. Laura's mind raced. Her janitorial cart was parked in the hall. On it was her coat, her keys, and a half-eaten bag of pretzels, and her pay stub with her full name and address. If Karitzis found it, he would know they were there. She had to get to the cart and move it. But that meant leaving Lena alone for 20 seconds. It was an unthinkable risk, but the risk of him finding them was greater. She made a nest of her sweater under the table, sat Lena down with Bingo, and put a finger to her lips. "Mama will be right back. You stay, quiet mouse." Lena looked up with wide, trusting eyes and nodded. Laura crept to the doorway. The hall was empty and silent. She could see the edge of her cart 10 feet away. She could also see the sliver of light from Hall's partially open office door. She took a breath and darted out, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the carpet. As she grabbed the handle of the cart, she heard voices from inside the office. Karitzis was talking loudly, rehearsing his grievances to Hall. "You think I'm a number in a file? You think my life is a column you can write off?" Laura froze, the cart halfway to the conference room. Then, from under the table, Lena let out a frustrated coo. It wasn't loud, but in the tomb-like silence of the empty floor, it echoed. The voice in the office stopped. Laura's blood turned to ice. She shoved the cart into the conference room, scooped Lena up, and retreated to the farthest corner behind the credenza. She held her breath. Seconds ticked by, then the sound of Hall's office door opening wider, footsteps. Karitzis, with Hall in tow, the cable between them, stepped into the hallway. He looked left, then right. "Hello," he called out. "Is someone there? You can come out. I'm not going to hurt you." The offer hung in the air, oily and false. Laura squeezed Lena tighter, praying the child would stay silent. After a minute, Karitzis snorted. "Probably a rat," he said to Hall, and pulled him back into the office, closing the door harder this time. Laura sank to the floor, shaking. They were trapped. The police didn't know they were there. The gunman was now actively suspicious, and they had no food, no water for Lena, and no way out. The only bathroom was down the hall past the office. The night stretched ahead, an endless dark corridor of peril. She looked at her daughter's innocent face, and a fierce, primal determination hardened within her. She would get Lena out of this. She didn't know how, but she would. In the office, the dynamic was shifting. Karitzis had found a radio in Hall's desk and tuned it to WIBC, the local news station. He wanted to hear the coverage. When the first bulletin broke, "A hostage situation is underway at the Hall building downtown," a strange smile touched his lips. He was no longer just Tony Karitzis, failed speculator. He was a headline. He turned to Hall. "They're listening now." He then placed another call, this time directly to the WIBC newsroom. He asked for Fred Heckman, a respected newsman. To everyone's shock, he was patched through. "Fred, this is Tony Karitzis. I'm here with Richard Hall. I have a message for the police." He then laid out his non-negotiable demands: a full pardon from the governor, $300,000 in cash, and a plane to fly them out of the country. The demands were impossible, designed to be rejected. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he was now talking to the city, live on air. The police commander, Roberts, listened in horror from the floor below. The gunman had just taken the podium. This was no longer a police siege. It was a public broadcast. Hall, wired to his chair, experienced a bizarre dissociation. The voice on the radio was discussing him, his life, his impending death, as a news item. He heard the tremor in the announcer's voice, the professional calm cracking with genuine fear. It made the situation real in a way the cold gun barrel had not. He was a story now, and stories have endings. Karitzis hung up the radio phone and seemed to relax slightly. He even offered Hall a glass of water, holding it to his lips, because Hall's hands were kept visible on the desk. The mundane act was more terrifying than the shouting. It implied a long night, a partnership. By 10 p.m., the nation was watching. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. The story had everything: a wealthy executive, a desperate everyman, a deadly contraption, and a live radio feed. Inside the building, the police strategy was in disarray. The negotiator couldn't get Karitzis to stay on a private line. He only wanted to talk through Heckman on WIBC. Every conversation was public, every demand amplified. The mayor was involved. The governor was awakened, and the FBI was on its way. But the greatest complication remained the secret in the conference room. At around 11, Lena began to cry in earnest. She was hungry, tired, and confused. Laura tried everything, jiggling her, singing the softest lullaby, offering a dry cracker from her pocket. The cries became soft, miserable whimpers that were somehow worse than screams. They were the sound of a child's spirit breaking. Laura knew they couldn't last. She made a decision. She would reveal herself. She would trade herself for her daughter's safe passage out. It was the only card she had to play. She stood up, her legs stiff and shaky. She kissed Lena's head, tucked her behind the credenza with Bingo, and whispered a final goodbye. Then she walked to the conference room door, took a deep breath, and stepped into the hallway. She walked directly toward the sliver of light under Richard Hall's office door. She raised a hand to knock. And inside, at that precise moment, Tony Karitzis was having a crisis of his own. The adrenaline was fading. The reality of what he had done, the irreversible step, was settling in. He looked at Hall, pale and rigid in the chair, and for a flicker of a second, Hall saw not a monster, but a terribly tired, lost man. "I didn't want this," Karitzis muttered, almost to himself. "You made me do this." It was the first crack in his resolve. Hall, the master of reading subtle shifts, saw it, and he knew that a cracking resolve in a man holding a live trigger was the most dangerous thing of all. Before he could speak, a soft knock echoed through the office. Both men froze. Karitzis' head snapped toward the door. The moment of vulnerability vanished, replaced by wired alertness. "Who is it?" he barked, the gun shifting in his hand. Outside, Laura Chin, her heart hammering against her ribs, prepared to speak, but she never got the chance. Because from down the hall, from the conference room she had just left, came the clear, unmistakable sound of a toddler's footsteps running straight toward her. Lena didn't run to her mother. She ran past her, straight toward the open office door, her stuffed dog bouncing behind her. Laura made a desperate grab, but her fingers brushed only air. "Lena, no." The whisper was a sharp blade in the silence. The child pushed the door open wider and stood in the threshold, looking in. Tony Karitzis spun around, the shotgun swinging with him, the cable pulling taut against Hall's neck. For a second, everyone froze. Karitzis stared. He saw a tiny girl in a pink sweater, clutching a ragged stuffed dog, her cheeks flushed from sleep. Not a cop, not a negotiator, a toddler. His face, a mask of furious intensity, slackened into pure, uncomprehending shock. What the hell? Laura lunged forward, placing herself between her daughter and the gun. "She's mine. She's just a baby, please." Her voice broke. Richard Hall, from his wired chair, saw the scene unfold as if in a dream. The cleaning woman, the child from the sounds in the hall. A new, horrific variable had entered the equation. His calculated risk assessment mind short-circuited. A child changed everything. Kiritsis did lower the gun. He looked from Laura to Lena, then back to Hall. A terrible, calculating light entered his eyes. "You," he said to Laura, "you were here the whole time." It wasn't a question. He saw her uniform, the terror on her face, the maternal ferocity in her stance. He saw leverage. "Get in, both of you now." Laura scooped Lena up and stepped into the office, the door closing behind her with a soft click that felt final. The room was close, warm with the heat of fear and the stale smell of cold coffee. Lena, oblivious to the weapon, pointed at the wires running from Hall's head to Kiritsis's wrist. "Buzzy?" she asked. The absurdity of the word hung in the air. Kiritsis let out a choked sound that was almost a laugh. "No, kid, not Buzzy, this is serious." But the spell of his monolithic rage had been punctured. He had an audience he hadn't planned for, an audience that didn't understand his manifesto. Laura held Lena close, her mind racing. She had just moved from hiding to the center of the storm. Her plan to trade herself was obsolete. They were all hostages now. Down on 33, Commander Roberts got the update from a sniper across the street. "Command, I've got visual. Hostage taker has 2 additional subjects in the room, an adult female and a very small child, a toddler." The air left the command post. The baby from the missing persons report. They were alive and they were in the kill box. The tactical impossibility of the situation hardened into concrete. Any assault was now guaranteed to result in a child's death. The FBI negotiator, who had just arrived, put his head in his hands. "We have to get that child out," he said. "Nothing else matters until that child is out." But getting her out meant talking Kiritsis into it, and Kiritsis was now using the child as a shield. He positioned Laura and Lena in a corner, visible from the window. "They won't gas us now," he said to Hall, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "They won't rush us, they see the kid." He was right. The police snipers relayed the new formation. The gunmen used the woman and child as living barricades. The standoff was locked in a new, more terrible stasis. Hours bled into the early morning. Lena, exhausted, fell asleep in Laura's arms. The quiet rhythm of the child's breathing became the strangest sound in the room, a metronome of normalcy against the backdrop of madness. Kiritsis paced, but he was quieter. He kept looking at the sleeping child. Laura, seizing on the only tool she had, began to speak, not about demands or deals, but about the mundane. "Her name is Lena. She likes strawberries. She's afraid of the vacuum cleaner." She spoke softly, calmly, weaving a thread of humanity into the room. Hall listened. Kiritsis pretended not to. Then at around 3 a.m., Kiritsis made a mistake. He needed to use the bathroom, a private bathroom connected to the office. The cable wasn't long enough to allow Hall to stay at the desk. He had to bring him, but he couldn't bring the woman and child. He hesitated, looking at them. "Don't move," he snarled. He shoved Hall toward the bathroom door, the cable stretching. As they disappeared inside, Laura saw her chance. Not to escape, the office door was too far, too loud, but to communicate. Hall's desk phone was on the floor, the cord ripped from the wall, but his briefcase was open near her foot. Inside, among papers, was a silver pen. She acted fast. She laid Lena down gently, grabbed the pen, and scrawled on the back of a discarded financial report lying on the floor. She wrote 3 words, "No EXPLOSIVES here." She didn't know if it was true, but Kiritsis had only ever mentioned the gun. She folded the paper small, crawled to the office door, and slid it underneath, into the hallway. It was a message in a bottle, cast into the dark sea of the corridor. A second later, the bathroom door opened, and Kiritsis emerged with Hall. The paper was found 10 minutes later by a police officer on a slow, silent belly crawl down the hall. It was rushed to command. "No EXPLOSIVES here." The relief was immediate but cautious. Was it true? A trick? The commander authorized a delicate probe. Using a fiber optic camera under the door of an adjacent office, they scanned the hall and the base of Hall's door. No wires, no packages. The initial bomb threat might have been a bluff. This changed the tactical picture slightly. If they could get the door open, they might have a shot, but the child was still in the room. As dawn broke, Kiritsis's mood darkened again. The reality of his dead-end demands was setting in. The governor wasn't going to call. The money wasn't coming. He was running out of audience. In a fit of frustration, he kicked Hall's desk. Lena woke up, startled, and began to cry. The sound grated on Kiritzis. "Shut her up," he yelled at Laura. Laura rocked her daughter, but the cries continued. Then something remarkable happened. Lena, through her tears, wriggled out of her mother's arms. She walked over to Kiritzis, who was looming by the window. She held up her stuffed dog. "Bingo sad," she announced, her voice wobbly. "You mad?" Kiritzis looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He had been dehumanized by the system, turned into a problem, a file, a foreclosure. Now a 2-year-old was identifying his emotion, not his grievance, not his politics, his feeling. "Yeah," he said, the fight leaving his voice. "I'm mad." Lena patted his leg with Bingo. "Okay," she said, as if that settled it. She then turned and walked over to Richard Hall. She looked at the wires, then at his pale, strained face. "You sad too," she stated. Hall, who had not spoken a word in hours, felt a lump rise in his throat. He gave the smallest nod. In that moment, the geometry of the room shifted. It was no longer just a gunman and 3 hostages. It was 4 people in a room, 2 of whom were connected by a deadly wire, one fighting for her child, and the child herself, who was inadvertently conducting a kind of emotional triage. Laura saw the opening. "Mr. Kiritzis," she said, her voice steady for the first time. "Let me take her out. Just let me walk her to the door and hand her to a policeman. You'll still have us." "You'll still have him," she gestured to Hall. "She's just a baby. She doesn't understand any of this." Kiritzis stared at Lena, who was now trying to share a cracker with Bingo. He rubbed his face with his free hand. The performative anger was gone, replaced by a deep, weary exhaustion. "Fine," he muttered. "Take her, go to the door, tell them I want to talk to Fred on the radio in 5 minutes. No cops at the door." Laura's heart leapt. She picked Lena up, walked to the office door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty. She stepped out, held Lena up so the sniper could see and walked slowly toward the elevator bank. A SWAT officer appeared from a side door, his weapon lowered. She handed her daughter over. "Her name is Lena," she said, then turned and walked back to the office without looking back. She had traded her chance at freedom for her daughter's. She closed the door behind her. The room felt emptier, quieter, and somehow more dangerous. The relief in the command post was euphoric but brief. The child was safe, one down. But Kiritzis, now without that moral obstacle, was back on the radio with Fred Heckman, and his tone was darker, more volatile. "The kid's gone. Now we get down to business. I want the governor on the line in 30 minutes, or I start removing pieces of Mr. Hall." It was a new, gruesome escalation. The bluff of explosives was replaced by the direct threat of torture. Then at 8:17 a.m., the "wait, it gets worse" moment arrived. The building engineer, reviewing blueprints to see if they could access the office from above or below, made a horrifying discovery. The ventilation system for the 34th floor had a central intake on the roof, and during a routine inspection the previous month, a maintenance worker had reported a suspicious, wired package lodged near the fan housing. It had been logged, but in the bureaucratic shuffle, never removed or identified. The report had just been found. Kiritzis hadn't been bluffing about explosives. He had just placed them somewhere else. The entire floor's ventilation shaft was potentially booby-trapped. If police tried to use gas, or if a stray bullet hit that intake, they could trigger an explosion that would kill everyone in the office and potentially bring down the ceiling. Commander Roberts now faced a diabolical choice. A direct assault risked a blast, killing the hostages. Doing nothing meant Kiritzis might carry out his mutilation threat. They were trapped by a man who had thought several moves ahead. The only path left was the one they had been avoiding, giving Kiritzis a live, public platform and meeting at least some of his demands to buy time. They had to bring the governor into a conversation. The crisis was about to become a national political spectacle. And back in the office, Laura Chin, now alone with 2 desperate men, realized something. When she had handed Lena over, she had slipped something else into her daughter's tiny hand, the silver pen from Hall's briefcase, a meaningless object to a child. But if someone searched her, they would find it, and they would know it was a message. The pen had a small engraved inscription on its side, RDH Richard Hall. It was proof of life, and a signal that the people in the room were still thinking, still trying. She had just turned her toddler into a courier. The final, desperate play was now in the hands of a 2-year-old girl, sitting in a police car with a stuffed dog, clutching a pen she didn't understand. The resolution of this crisis would hinge on the one thing no tactical manual had ever considered: the innocent, unscripted power of a child. In the police car, a female officer gently pried the silver pen from Lena's tight fist. The child had fallen asleep, exhausted, but her hand was clamped around the object like a treasure. The officer saw the engraving immediately. RDH, she radioed command. The child had a silver pen, engraved with the hostage's initials. It's a signal, they're communicating. In the command post, the mood shifted. The note about no explosives had been a start. This was proof of conscious thought inside the room. They weren't just victims waiting, they were participants. Commander Roberts looked at the FBI negotiator. He's losing control of the narrative in there. The hostages are acting. That's when things break. Back in the office, the atmosphere had changed. With Lena gone, a strange emptiness settled over the three adults. Kiritzis was on edge, his eyes darting between Hall and Laura. The threat to remove pieces of Hall felt hollow now, a script he was struggling to remember. Laura, emboldened by her daughter's safety, did something radical. She stopped being invisible. "Tony," she said, using his first name, "they're not going to give you a plane. You know that, right?" Kiritzis glared at her. "They will if they want him alive." Laura shook her head. They'll wait. They'll wait until you're so tired you make a mistake, or until he," she nodded at Hall, "has a heart attack from the stress. Then they'll come in and you'll be dead. And for what? To prove a point to a man who already knows he messed up." Hall flinched. Kiritzis stared. "What did you say?" Laura pressed on. "He knows. Look at him. He's not the man you thought he was when you walked in here. That man broke hours ago." She was speaking to Kiritzis, but her words were for Hall. She was offering him a path out of the caricature of the cold banker. Hall understood. He let his shoulders slump, not in defeat, but in a show of human frailty. He looked Kiritzis in the eye. "She's right," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I was wrong, not just about your loan, about the way I do business." It was the first concession, and it wasn't about money, it was about morality. This unexpected turn, the housekeeper and the mogul subtly aligning against the narrative of his grievance through Kiritzis. His whole performance was built on Hall as an unfeeling monolith. Now the monolith was apologizing, and a cleaning woman was the one facilitating it. The power dynamic, once so clear, was muddled. He switched back to the radio, demanding the governor, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Outside, the bomb squad, using remote cameras, finally located the suspicious package in the ventilation shaft. It was not dynamite. It was a collection of road flares, batteries, and wires assembled to look menacing. A bluff, but a convincing one. The immediate explosive threat was neutralized. This information was relayed to Commander Roberts. The calculus changed again. The biggest physical danger was now just the shotgun. An assault was back on the table, but it was still a last resort. The negotiator had a new idea. He wants an audience, give him a bigger one, but on our terms. They arranged for a live telephone call between Kiritzis and Governor Otis Bowen to be broadcast on WIBC. It was an unprecedented move. At 10:18 a.m., the call was patched through. The governor, speaking calmly, refused a pardon but offered a fair trial and a review of his case. It was what any citizen would get. It was a rejection, but a respectful one. It gave Kiritzis a face-saving off-ramp. He argued, but weakly. The fight was leaving him. When the call ended, he sat heavily in a chair opposite Hall. The shotgun wavered. Laura saw the opening. She stood up slowly. "Tony, it's over," she said softly. "You made your point. The whole country heard it. Now you can end it without anyone else getting hurt. You can walk out of here and tell your story in a courtroom." She took a small step toward him. "Give me the gun." Kiritzis looked from her to Hall, then at the wires in his hand. The grand escape fantasy had evaporated, leaving only the bleak reality of concrete and bars. He was just a tired, broken man in a room. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." He began to carefully unwind the cable from his wrist, but his hands were shaking. As he reached to disconnect the wire from the trigger mechanism behind Hall's head, his fingers slipped. A loud click echoed in the office. Laura gasped. Hall shut his eyes. Kiritzis froze, his face white with terror. It was the sound of the hammer being cocked. The gun was now live in a way it hadn't been before. The safety was off. One twitch, one stumble, and it would fire. The fragile piece shattered. "Don't move," Kiritzis hissed, panic flooding back into his veins. Nobody move. But someone did move. From the hallway, amplified by a bullhorn, a police negotiator's voice boomed. "Tony, we need you to send Laura out now. We have news about Lena." It was a tactical lie, a ploy to get the remaining civilian out, but it had the opposite effect on Kiritsis. It felt like a trick, a betrayal of the fragile understanding they'd just reached. He swung the gun toward the door. "No, no more deals. You're trying to trick me." In that moment of distracted fury, Richard Hall did the only thing he could. He couldn't move from the waist down, but his arms were free. He didn't lunge for the gun that would pull the cable. Instead, he reached out with his right hand and grabbed Kiritsis' trembling wrist, the one still connected to the wire. He held it not with violence, but with a firm, steady pressure. He was stabilizing the trigger. "Tony," Hall said, his voice low and astonishingly calm, "look at me." Kiritsis' wild eyes met his. "It's all right, just set it down. Slowly, I'm not letting go, I've got you." It was a staggering reversal. The hostage was now physically steadying his captor to prevent both their deaths. Laura watched, breath held. Kiritsis, guided by Hall's firm grip, slowly lowered the shotgun to the floor. Hall maintained his hold until the weapon was settled on the carpet. Then, still holding Kiritsis' wrist, he used his other hand to carefully unwind the cable from his own neck. He dropped the lethal loop to the floor. The physical tether was broken. Hall then did the unthinkable. He released Kiritsis' wrist and, in one fluid motion, pulled the man into an awkward, seated embrace. Kiritsis, utterly spent, collapsed against him, sobbing. The performance was over. The man remained. Laura rushed forward and kicked the shotgun across the room, well out of reach. She then went to the office door, unlocked it, and opened it wide. She stood in the doorway and simply said, "It's over." SWAT officers swarmed in, but there was no struggle to be had. They found Richard Hall quietly holding a weeping Tony Kiritsis, while Laura Chin stood by the window, letting the morning sun wash over her face. The siege of the Hall building ended at 11:04 a.m. after 63 hours. The rescue everyone expected, a tactical takedown, a sniper's bullet, never happened. The rescue that did happen was human, messy, and born from the cumulative pressure of a child's innocence, a mother's courage, and a mogul's shattered pride. The aftermath was complex. Tony Kiritsis was charged with kidnapping, armed robbery, and extortion. His trial began that October. His defense attorney, leveraging the unprecedented live broadcast of his grievances, mounted an insanity defense. The jury saw the tapes of the emotional, erratic man. They also saw the testimony of Richard Hall, who spoke not with vengeance, but with a strange, respectful gravity about the man's broken state. On October 21, 1977, the jury found Tony Kiritsis not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to the Indiana Mental Health Institution, not a prison. The verdict sparked outrage and led directly to Indiana changing its laws, shifting the burden of proof for insanity onto the defense. Richard Hall never returned to Merchants National Bank. The experience had unmade him. He sold his company, donated a significant portion of his wealth to housing advocacy groups, and retreated from public life. But he did not return to his silent Georgian house. He bought a smaller home, one with a garden. He was often seen sitting in it, reading. And Laura Chin, she received a modest financial settlement from Hall, not as hush money, but as a genuine thank you. She used it to take business classes. She opened a small, successful office cleaning company of her own, one that paid living wages and offered childcare. She never had to choose between her daughter and her job again. The final surprise, the one that ties this all together, came years later. A researcher compiling an oral history of the incident tracked down an adult Lena Chin. She was a school teacher. When asked what she remembered of that day, she laughed softly. "Almost nothing. I remember nice policemen giving me a lollipop. I remember missing Bingo, my dog." But then she paused. "My mom told me one story, though. She said that in the middle of it all, I gave my cracker to the sad man." She said it was the moment everything started to change. The researcher asked if she believed that. Lena thought for a moment. "I believe that people forget how to be people sometimes, and sometimes it takes someone who hasn't learned yet to remind them." The unthinkable act wasn't a tactical masterstroke. It was the cumulative effect of a toddler's unguarded empathy, a mother's fierce love, and a billionaire's final, humbling reach for connection. It was a lesson in human physics, taught in a locked room 34 stories high, that the smallest force, applied at precisely the right point of breaking tension, can change the trajectory of everything. And with that lesson learned, the story finds its closing breath and its meaning opens up to all of us. So what do we do with a story like this? A story where the villain and the victim end in an embrace, where a housekeeper becomes the hero, and a toddler's cracker holds more power than a negotiator's manual. We remember that the most complex systems, be they financial, legal, or tactical, are still operated by and ultimately broken by human hearts. The Tony Kiritsis incident left a permanent mark. It reformed insanity defense laws. It forever changed how journalists report on live crises, forcing a difficult balance between public information and public safety. But its deepest legacy is simpler and quieter. It asks us a question that echoes far beyond that office on the 34th floor. When someone is trapped, whether in a wheelchair of grief, in the straitjacket of rage, or in the literal wires of a dead man's line, what reaches them? Often, it is not the grand intervention. It is the small, unscripted human thing, the bandage with a cartoon star, the shared cracker, the hand that steadies the very wrist that threatens it. These are the forces that recalibrate broken worlds. Richard Hall, Tony Kiritsis, Laura and Lena Chin, they all walked different paths out of that building, and their lives were never the same. But they shared one profound, common truth. They were seen, in their most broken moments, not as roles, but as people. That seeing was the first step out of the silence. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that transformation often whispers instead of shouts, then you're in the right place. This channel is dedicated to the narratives that operate in those quiet spaces, the moments of unexpected courage, the grace notes in the chaos, the choices that redefine a life. We don't chase the loudest headlines. We listen for the stories that are worth staying for. So if you believe, as we do, that these stories matter, hit that subscribe button. Become part of a community that values depth over distraction. Tell us in the comments, when has a small, unexpected act of humanity changed the course of your day or your life? Share this with someone who needs the reminder that no one is beyond reach and no situation is without a thread of hope. Thanks for listening.